morning, Cornerstone. How's everybody doing today? So everybody's enjoying fellowship. That's good. It's good to see you all this morning. Let's go to our hearts now. Let's focus on the Lord and worship Him this morning. Let's stand and sing together. morning. Oh, yeah. Good morning. 1 John and 2 John. Good morning and welcome. We're so glad you guys are here, and I think we're glad we're here doing the announcements. I had two people come up to me and say, "You doing the announcements?" I said, "Yes, I'm your announcer guy. My name is Steve Roberts, and besides the announcer guy, I'm also the men's ministry leadership team. We have a connection card, and if you're visiting for the first time or it's been a while and you want us to connect with you, please fill that out, stick it in the announcement box. If you have a prayer request, we love to pray over those prayer requests. Fill that out, stick it in the announcement box as well. If you have one that is for pastors on the phone, just put that with a blue envelope in the seat. Just put that prayer request in the blue envelope and stick it in the announcement box and put that. Just a few announcements. Women's Tuesday night Bible study begins this Tuesday, September 3rd. Can you believe it's September already? Wow, where did the time go by? Also, the Kids Project begins September 9th. Make sure to sign up for that. And all this information is in the bulletin folder. For those who are in leadership here, corrective leadership meeting September 8th after the next service, September 8th. So 7 days from today. Also, the women's retreat, there's still some spots left, so feel free to jump in on that. The women's Big Beat Monday starts September 9th. This one is a little bit more near and dear to my heart. Women's Field, October 18th at 6 p.m. We're also looking at planning a camping trip to the Maine, where we can go out and learn how to make fire and grunt and also to go out right? And there's also a youth adult conference and retreat September 20th to the 22nd, which is Friday through Sunday. Again, we're glad you guys are here. Just go out and look at this service. Father in heaven, thank you. Thank you so much for this day. Thank you for the message you provide to us. Lord, we ask you for your anointing to be upon the band, and to bring virtual and worship to you. Lord, we pray for the pastor, his message. Lord, we pray for the anointing on him. And all these things we do in the precious name. Stand first. Every Pharisee, you came for hypocrites, even while I you carry sin and shame, the guilt of every man, the weight of all I've done. Into your hands. It's running through my veins. I can't escape it.
Where Jesus bled and died for me, I see His wounds, His empty feet, my Savior on that perfect tree. His body well and dressed in blue. They laid Him down in justice true. He is free, my heavy soul. Messiah is good, and all alone. The blazing stars of His light, and I will rise above the storms. My grace and spirit of Jesus Christ.
I want to welcome everybody who's here this morning for on this Labor Day weekend. Thank you for joining with us. For those who aren't here, they're watching live stream, if you're on vacation or traveling, we pray for you today. We laugh at you tomorrow because you will be in traffic. No, I'm kidding. No, but anyway, it's good to have everybody this morning. We are in Luke chapter 18. We're going to be looking at verses 9 through 17, a parable that Jesus tells. We looked at the parable last week. He gives another parable, or Luke records another parable that Jesus spoke now. And he says, starting in verse 9, and he, Jesus, also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying thus to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I pay tithes of all that I've given. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And they were bringing even their babies to him so that he would touch them. And when the disciples saw it, they began rebuking him. But Jesus called for them, saying, Permit for the children to come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as you. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child will not enter it at all. A doctor, a lawyer, a Boy Scout, and a Southern Baptist pastor were all on an afternoon flight on a private small plane. True story. Just kidding. And while the plane was in mid-flight, it suddenly developed these engine problems. And despite the pilot's best efforts, the plane was going to go down. So knowing that the plane was going to crash, the pilot grabbed one of the parachutes. He yelled to the passengers that they better do the same, and he jumped out the side door of the plane. Unfortunately, there were only 3 parachutes, and there were 4 passengers. The doctor grabs one of the parachutes and says, look, I'm a doctor, I save lives for a living, I've got to live, I've got to survive this. So he grabbed one, and he jumps out the side door of the plane. The lawyer looks at the other two and he says, look, I'm a lawyer, and lawyers are the smartest people in the world, so I have to live. So he grabs the pack and he jumps out the plane. The Baptist pastor kneels down next to the little boy's cabin. He says, son, I know that when I die, I'm going to heaven because I have faith in Jesus. He says, I've lived a long, full life. He says, you're young and you have your whole life ahead of you. He says, I want you to take my parachute. The little Boy Scout takes the pastor by his hand and he hands him the parachute and says, Pastor, we can both take one. The smartest man in the world just jumped out of my backpack. The lesson of that is beware of having confidence in yourself. You know, in our study today, we meet a religious man, a Pharisee, who has a false sense of confidence. He is trusting in himself that he's righteous and that his righteousness will get him into heaven. I want to begin by challenging you with a question this morning. If I were to ask you to complete this sentence, I know that I am going to heaven when I die because, how would you finish that sentence? How would you fill in that blank? If your answer is anything other than Jesus paid for my sin and died on the cross, then you're probably living with a false sense of confidence. If a person tries to add anything to the finished work of Jesus Christ to earn their salvation, they're living with a false sense of confidence. We can't add anything to what Jesus has done on the cross. And you know, that's the good news. You know, people go, well, that doesn't sound like good news to me. No, that's great news. Because if we could add anything to it, we would always be wondering, have I added enough? And then we would just push ourselves to do more and to do more and to do more, never knowing if we have done enough. This parable today is for anyone who thinks that in any way you can earn your salvation. And Luke tells us that this parable, that Jesus told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. Now, I find this interesting because in the previous parable, remember the parable that Jesus told in our last study of the widow and the unjust judge. Luke tells us why Jesus told that parable, to show that at all times we ought to pray and not lose heart. And that is one of the few, if only one, of the parables in the Gospels where the writer tells us ahead of time why Jesus told that parable. Now, in this parable, Jesus doesn't tell us why he told the parable. Luke doesn't tell us why Jesus told the parable. He tells us to whom he told the parable. It is spoken to somebody specifically. Jesus is addressing everyone who trusts in their own righteousness. People who look at their righteousness, and then as a result of that, as a result of their so-called good works, they hold everybody else in contempt who doesn't live up to their standard. And you may have met people like that before, that they trust in their own right standing before God. As a pastor, I tell you what, I meet people like that all the time. I talk to people about the gospel and all that. Well, you know, I think I'm good enough. And I get where they're coming from because prior to when I got saved at the age of 17, I thought the same thing. Well, I go to church, I've never killed anybody, I'm not involved in it, I don't steal from people, I'm pretty good. I'm going to get to heaven. You know, God's going to, compared to everybody else around me, I'm doing pretty good. That's how I view myself. And people who believe they're getting in on their works often point to the spiritual works that they're doing to make themselves right before God, and they base it on all kinds of things. I mean, church membership or church attendance or my prayer life or my Bible reading or my giving or my serving or I'm just a good person. You know, they've got it. And those who trust in their own good works, have you noticed they often look down at others because they have some type of standard that they have set. You know, I don't smoke and I don't chew and I don't know what girls do. I mean, that's sort of the mentality of some people, you know, is that, you know, I've got these standards and all that. And, you know, you get into some of these churches, these holiness churches, and I've visited some of these before as a young person, and you know, they've got a whole list of things where you can't wear jeans, and, you know, women have to wear dresses, and women can't wear makeup, and you can't go to movies, and you can't go to dances, and you can't play cards, and the list just goes on ad nauseum. And I had somebody one time ask me, they thought I was a Baptist pastor, and they said, the Baptist pastor stands. And I said, well, some can and some can't. You know, I mean, it's just honest, you know. I was freebie here. I was down in South Carolina in July when my daughter was having heart surgery, and so I went into the hospital one morning and to the registration to get a pass, visitor pass from around. And the lady sitting at the desk, she looks at my name and she goes, "Chris Brown? You're Chris Brown?" And I said, "I am. I am the original Chris Brown." And she goes, "Can you dance like Chris Brown?" And I said, "Well, let me tell you something. The question is, can he dance like me?" And she starts laughing up and on. She goes, "You going to dance with me?" I said, "I think I can bust a move." Like, oh my, I tell you what, I just lost it. So, gotta have a little fun with people, right? So that all that to say that I lost my place in my message right now. But people put their trust in these types of things, crazy things, right? Well, Jesus introduces this parable. He says, two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. So he begins to lay out this parable. And according to Jewish tradition, there were 3 times that were set aside every day for prayer in the temple. 9 in the morning, midday, noon, and then 3 in the afternoon. And so many people would go to the temple during those times to pray. Devout Jews also believed that prayers were more effective if they were offered in the temple. And I think that goes back to a verse in Isaiah 56 where the Lord said, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all people." And as you probably know what that verse, Jesus later quoted that in the New Testament. That the temple was meant to be a place of prayer, but not just for the Jews, for everyone. And so Jews believe that, well, if we go to the temple and pray, our prayers are more effective. So that to say that the temple courts were often crowded 3 times a day. You go in there about 9 o'clock in the morning, a lot of people praying in there. You go in there at noon, a lot of people pray. You go in at 3 in the afternoon, people are praying. You go into the book of Acts, Peter, and even as believers, they were still going into the temple in the afternoon at the hour of prayer. So they were still observing these hours of prayer. Now, the Pharisees like to use these prayer times as an opportunity to gain public recognition. It's because it became a time of public display for their spirituality. It wasn't really a time where they wanted to commune with God. It was a time where they wanted to show off how spiritual they were. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus even called them out on this. He called them hypocrites. He says, because they love to stand and pray in the synagogue in order to be seen by men. In order to be seen by men. That was their whole purpose of praying. It wasn't to draw close to God. We just wrapped up 21 days of prayer. And I'll tell you what, it was a phenomenal time. For those who were here, we came in every morning, we had some flat music on, and we just prayed. And, many of you put out prayer requests on the index card, and we were praying through those, constantly praying through those. And there were some days where I would come in here, and I didn't even get to the cards because the Lord had already laid some things on my heart to pray for. And I was just, the whole time was spent just in that type of prayer. But it was a beautiful time. But we weren't coming in here for other people. It wasn't a show and tell like the Pharisees had at this time. Now, the Pharisees also like to offer long prayers to be seen by others. Jesus talked about that as well. But these 2 men, this Pharisee and this tax collector, they show up at the temple at the same time to pray. These 2 men had a lot of things in common. First of all, they both went to the temple. They both went there for the purpose of prayer, and they both went there at the same time. But that's where the similarities between these 2 men end. Because when it comes to outward appearances, they couldn't have been further apart. When the people would look at that Pharisee, they would say, well, here's a man who's devoted himself to being a spiritual person, to being a righteous person. And, they did all these things, to have that appearance of spirituality in front of people. But on the antithesis of that was the tax collector. The tax collector was considered by Jews to be a traitor. He was a Jew who basically took taxes from his own people for a government that occupied their land. And so he was, very disregarded by people. He was an outcast of society. So 2 extreme examples that Jesus gives us in this parable. Now, Jesus tells us how these 2 men prayed. The Pharisee stood and he was praying thus to himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like the other people. I'm not swindler, unjust, adulterer, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I pay tithes of all that I get. This is an interesting prayer, in my opinion. What stands out the most in this Pharisee's prayer is the focus on himself. Look at what he says. I thank you. I am not like other people. I fast. I pray. I give. This guy's got a serious eye problem. I mean, I bet you when he went to the temple, he probably took his iPhone and his iPad. Okay. Mark that off for the second service. I wish I would too. But, notice the Pharisee begins his praying his prayer by, God, I thank you. Now look at the rest of his prayer. Do you find that beginning sort of ironic? It's good to begin our prayers with thanksgiving. But let me ask you something. Is this guy really thankful for anything? He immediately begins to tell God that he's not like other people. Oh, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. And he begins to list off all the sins that he is disgusted by in these other people. And then he goes on to tell God all the good things that he's done. So let me ask you something. Is he really thanking God for anything? Is he really thankful to God for anything? No, he's just telling God. He's just sort of broadcasting to God all the good things he does and all the bad things that he doesn't do. And I think it's interesting that Jesus tells us something about this Pharisee at the beginning. He says, thus he prayed to himself. You see, whenever we start telling God how great we are, our prayers aren't getting to heaven. They're just bouncing off the ceiling. We're just hearing ourselves pray. God's not impressed with all the good things we do, or that we do, because they are not going to get us into heaven. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 64, Isaiah tells us that all of our righteousness is like filthy rags before God. All the good things that we think we're doing are not impressive to God. The only reason our works of righteousness even look good to us is because we're usually comparing ourselves to other people. We're not comparing ourselves to the true standard, which is Jesus Christ. I read an interesting story the other day. It was given in one of the commentaries by William Barclay. William Barclay was a Scottish preacher, and he has a lot of interesting insights into his commentary. So he was talking about one time he was going from Scotland into England, and he was passing through Yorkshire. And he said as the train was going by, he went through this little village and all of these cottages. He said he noticed this one cottage that had been whitewashed. There was just this brilliant white in the sunshine. He noticed that it stood out from all the other cottages. He said he sort of caught his eye. Well, he went on into England and he had some time there for a few days. And as he was returning back to Scotland, during his stay in England, it had snowed in Yorkshire. And so when the train was coming through, the whole land was just covered with this pure white snow. He said as he came back through, he saw the same cottage. But this time it looked a lot different. Because this time it looked sort of dingy. And it didn't look near as clean and brilliant as it had the first time. And sort of noticed that and realized because the contrast between the pure white snow and before the contrast around the other cottages. And I would suggest to you that is sort of what happens with us. When we compare ourselves to all the people around us, we can always find people that are worse than us, can't we? Well, I may not be great, but I'm better than that person over there, or I'm better than that person over there, or that person I work with, or my neighbor over here, or the pastor at the church, or whatever. I mean, you can just compare yourself to anybody and find someone that you're better than. But when we make that comparison with Jesus Christ, guess what? We don't look that great, do we? Because all of a sudden, we begin to see that the real standard, the standard for righteousness in heaven, is not the people around us. It's the standard that God set in His Son, Jesus Christ. And so sometimes we don't look so good. Well, we don't look so good when it comes to that. So this Pharisee saw himself as a good person because he's comparing himself to everybody else around him. And he's saying, well, I don't swindle people. I'm not unjust. I'm not an adulterer. And then he looks behind him, and he probably looked behind him because he was praying out loud and wanted to see who's listening to him. And he notices this tax collector, so he points out that he's definitely not like that guy back there. See, the Pharisee took pride not only in what he didn't do, but he was taking pride in what he did do. And he talks about how he fasts twice a week. Now, this is interesting to me because under the Jewish law, Leviticus chapter 16, and there's other verses too, but there was only one day in the year when the Jews were actually required to fast, and that was the Day of Atonement. That's the day that we often refer to today as Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement for the nation. That was to be a day that they were to fast. Now, many of the Pharisees, though, had a tradition of fasting twice a week. And it was interesting that they would always fast on Mondays Pharisees. And I find that interesting because in ancient Israel, Mondays and Thursdays were the market days in Jerusalem when the town was the most crowded. So the Pharisees would come into the town looking all, ragged and disheveled and everything like that. And, they wanted to make this show to everybody of how spiritual they were for their fasting. And I think this Pharisee wanted to show that he's going above and beyond the law. Well, I'm only required to fast once a year, but I'm going to fast twice a week. The devil can get us into that. If we have a propensity for legalism, he can nail us down. And I tell you, I've seen that in my own life. I'm a fairly disciplined person. But the enemy can take discipline and he can run me to the ground with it. Because he can say, okay, well, I'm going to read a chapter every morning in the Bible. And you think, well, man, if I read a chapter, you know what? I tell you what, it would really be good if I read 3 chapters every morning. Well, if I read 3 chapters every morning, it might be great to read 5 chapters every morning. Well, if I read 5 chapters, it just goes on and on and on. I can pray for 5 minutes. Well, maybe if I pray for 10 minutes, I should pray for 20 minutes. And then, we can get into this thing where we get into this idea of, like, we are earning favor with God because of the more things that we do. Because we're doing more than anybody else. And so this Pharisee, he's got this idea of this righteousness. Then he says, well, I pay tithes on everything we receive. Now, Israel was and still is a very largely agricultural economy. And the law commanded that a tithe, or 1/10 of the produce of your field, were to be given to the Lord, specifically to the Levites who basically oversaw the worship in the temple. And like many of the Pharisees, this one decided he was going to go above and beyond the requirement, and so he was going to tithe from every single little plant that he had. Like, I've got 10 seeds. 1 seed goes to God. I've got 10 little this, and I'm going to give 1 of those to God. And I'm just going to do it. And so that was his whole mentality. This is how he sees himself earning his way to heaven. But now Jesus then gives us the prayer of the tax collector. Now, it's interesting to me, the tax collector is standing some distance away. He's not even willing to lift up his eyes to heaven. And he's beating on his chest. He says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. In contrast to the Pharisee, the tax collector, he doesn't come based on his own righteousness. He sees the depravity of his life. And he stands off at a distance, and I would suggest to you that he probably stood off at a distance because he knew that most people didn't even want him there at the temple. This guy's a tax collector. He probably knew most of the people that were in the temple that day. And he knows that they probably don't want him around, so he just sort of backs away from the crowd. He doesn't even lift his eyes to heaven because he doesn't feel like he's worthy. He begins to beat his chest, that sign of sorrow, extreme sorrow. And he doesn't boast about his own righteousness. He goes to the mercy of God. And it's interesting that he asks God, he says, be merciful to me, the sinner. And in the original text, it's important to understand that there's a definite article before the word sinner. Now, some of your translations may say, be merciful to me, a sinner. The actual literal translation is there, be merciful to me, the sinner. And there's an important differentiation there because the definite article implies that this tax collector sees himself as the ultimate sinner. He sees himself as the worst of the worst. And I believe that when we begin to spend time with God and we stop comparing ourselves to other people, guess what? We begin to see ourselves for what we are. Now remember, God's covered us in our righteousness, believers in a righteous robe of Jesus Christ. But we begin to see the depravity of our lives. And we see that in the writings of the Apostle Paul. When Paul was writing to the church in Corinth, Paul described himself as the least of the apostles. So of all the apostles, I'm the least of them. Sounds pretty good. Sounds humility, right? Paul later writes to the church in Ephesus, and he doesn't call himself the least of the apostles anymore. He calls himself the least of all the saints. So I'm not just the least of all the leaders, I'm the least of all the leaders. And then it's very interesting because later on, in his next to last letter before he goes and is martyred, he's writing to Timothy, and he calls himself the chief of sinners. You see, he began to see more and more of the contrast between God's righteousness with shortcomings. And I think that as we walk with the Lord, and the longer we walk with Him, and we begin to see the beauty and the glory of who Jesus Christ is, we recognize that sinful nature that's within us. But understand this too, what does that do? It also makes us grateful for what Jesus Christ has done for us in the cross. Because then we look at that and we realize, it's not, hey, Jesus died for my sins, that's great, what's the left? If we look at it and we realize, wow, Jesus died for my sins. I've learned as a pastor not to look in judgment towards other people. Because when I look at my own life, and I look at my own failures, I have the right to come to other people. I've learned that we have to humble ourselves before God because, you look at the magnitude, and the interesting thing about it was, if I was the only person in the world, or if you were the only person in the world, Jesus would have still gone to the cross for you. He would have still gone to the cross. And that's the beauty of His mercy. Now, we have to be careful because we can tend to think that our prayers are answered in direct proportion to how many good things we do. I would imagine the Pharisee was thinking that too, that he was going to come in here and he was going to pray, and he wanted to make sure that God understands that, hey, he's one righteous dude, you know what I mean? So these prayers ought to be answered. I'm always amused when people come to me and they feel like because I'm a pastor that somehow my prayers get to heaven more than anybody else's, and they're going to get up there like, oh, wait a minute, Christmas prayers coming in. Okay, hold all the other prayers. Here comes Christmas prayers. That's not how it works, okay? He hears your prayers just as much as he hears my prayers and the next person, your next believers. And so it's not that way. But, when Scripture teaches it, we can certainly hinder our prayers. There are passages that tell us how our prayers can be hindered. But prayer is not based on our merit. It is based on His mercy. And when we draw near to God, when we draw near to His throne of grace, it says that He was confident that we may receive mercy and find help in our time of need. We're not coming there on our own good works. We don't have to go, God, I've been really good this week, and I've been good with my devotional time, and I read all my scripture verses when I had time, and I had this much prayer time. We don't need to do that. We come before His throne of grace with confidence because Jesus Christ died on the cross for us, and we are covered in that righteousness. And when God looks at us, He looks at the righteousness that's covering us through Jesus Christ. And that's why we can draw near. This tax collector, he didn't make an excuse for sin. He didn't try to explain away sin. He didn't even make promises. God, I promise I'll never do this again. I messed up here. I messed up there. When we pray and we say, Lord, forgive me, I'll never do that again. We're trusting in our flesh. We're trusting in our flesh. Because we're thinking, well, I have the strength to never do that again. Well, you know what? We are very weak. The Scripture says that we're dust. And that sometimes, I tell you what, I really feel like dust. Sometimes when I look at the struggles in my life, but Jesus now draws this conclusion of this parable, and he closes it with an interesting principle. Jesus says, I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. The Pharisee thought he was righteous, and all his righteous works were going to get him into heaven. The tax collector knew that he wasn't righteous, and he cries out to God for mercy. The Pharisee, he's blind to his condition. The tax collector was very aware of his condition. And so the Pharisee's pride condemns him, but the tax collector's humble faith saves him. And Jesus concludes and says, everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. There's a principle in this parable, very simply put. The way up is always the way down, and the way down is always the way up. If we, like the Pharisees, if we try to work out, if we try to exalt ourselves and talk about all the good things we've done, God's going to bring us low. God's going to humble us. We see a vivid example of this in Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14 talks about Lucifer, who was one of the exalted angels at one time. And here's what he said. He said, I will ascend to the heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the recess of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. You hear what he's saying there? I will. 5 I wills. So here's what I'm going to do. And like this Pharisee, Satan had that eye problem when it came to exalting himself to all the things that he was going to do. And the Scripture says right after that, in Isaiah 14, verses 15 through 19, that God thrust Satan down into the recesses of his life. But look at the example that we have of humility, and obviously it comes from Jesus Christ found in the book of Philippians chapter 2. Scripture says that Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, and for this reason, God highly exalted him. Jesus took on the form of a servant, and God exalted him. When we humble ourselves before God, God can then raise us up to where he wants us to be. We don't have to do it. We don't have to, give God our resume about how many wonderful things we've done. When God sees a heart of humility, then he can raise us up to where he wants us to be. Jesus concludes this parable, or Luke concludes the story at the end of this parable with a very interesting thing where Jesus is finishing up this parable, and then all the people are bringing their children to Jesus. I think that must have been a beautiful picture there, as they all, these families are flocking to Jesus with their kids. It's just so that he might touch them. One of the ancient customs of the Jews was bringing children to the rabbi for blessing. And the Jewish Talmud, which is like basically the primary source of Jewish law, comes from the scriptures, after the scriptures, they taught that the parents could bring their child to a rabbi and he would lay his hands on them and bless them and then pray for them and pray for their future. And so that was sort of the idea was that we have something similar to that today. When we have a child born in a congregation, the parents can bring it up and you dedicate that child. Now again, that's not infant baptism or anything like that. It's just simply saying we are dedicating this child to the Lord. This is Hannah dedicated her child. We are praying for the parents that they will raise that child in a godly home. And we are, as a congregation, agreeing to support this family to raise that child to grow up and to know Jesus Christ. I pray for the children in our CLA. I pray for my grandkids. And God will give them a tender heart towards the things of God. And so, there's that aspect of just basically bringing and pronouncing a blessing on that child and praying over that child. We don't know what we're going through the minds of the disciples when they talk to the baby's parents and bring their kids to Jesus. And you never know what's going on. The disciples may thought, well, this is interrupting Jesus' teaching. We can't let that happen. Maybe they thought, well, Jesus is tired. He needs a rest, and all these parents are crowding around him. They may have even thought that Jesus viewed these children as an inconvenience. Kids can't be bothered. Jesus, he's got more important things to do. We don't know what their reasoning was, but whatever it was wrong. And this is not the first time the disciples tried to do this. I think the disciples sort of felt like they had this little inside track with Jesus where hey, we're important, you're not, and so we're here, we're Jesus' bodyguards, right? We're just going to protect Jesus because we don't want anything to happen to him. It's just Jesus needed bodyguards, right? We got late one afternoon, and Jesus was teaching the crowd, and the disciples wanted Jesus to send the crowd away. Lord, it's getting late. People are getting hungry. The closest Wawa is like 10 miles away. Send the people away. Send the people away. He's like, no, we're going to feed them. He had that compassion for the people. When they went into Fire and Stone, the Syrophoenician woman, I think it was, she basically came, there was a Canaanite woman, she's asking Jesus to heal her daughter. And they try to push the woman away. The Lord told her to go away from her so much. And he's like, wow. And he heals his daughter. You see, we never got compassion for people. This speaks to me personally. I never want to get a sermon where I tell you what I think you need to do. Because I always want to read the scriptures for what is God trying to say to me. And hopefully, it relates to things you're dealing with as well. But I'm not going to find fault with the disciples before there are times when I need to have more compassion for other people as well. I was very blessed a couple months ago. I had a friend call me out with my compassion or lack of compassion for another person. And I was very glad that they did that because I needed that wake-up call. And that's what I consider true friends. When people will speak into your life and they'll speak truth into your life, you better consider them a true friend. And sometimes we get upset when people say perspectives because we know it's true and we don't like to hear it. But we ought to consider people who are really willing to speak in their lives as being their true friends. And it's easy to get so preoccupied as a pastor with my schedule. I got this to do, I got that to do, and my week is filled up early. And I get into this schedule mindset of like, I got to get this done and this done and this done, and I got to check this off and check this off. And what can happen as a pastor, I'm just saying, I can get to a place where I'm so busy doing things, I forget about people. And that's a problem. And sometimes I need to be reminded that the most important ministry that I can have on any day that involves a person who's doing the right thing. And I want to challenge you to think about that too. That sometimes we get really busy with our schedules, and God divinely places somebody right in front of us because they need to be ministered to. They need to be listened to. They need to be prayed for. They need to be know that someone loves them and cares enough to take the time for them. So I look at what Jesus did there, and Jesus corrects the disciples. It's a good correction for me. It says, "Permit the children to come to you. Go and hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly, I say to you that whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child is not going to enter at all." And you think about that last verse. Whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child will not enter at all. That should be a red flag for us to go, wait a minute. That is speaking to me. If I want to get into the kingdom of heaven, then I've got to enter it like a little child. Well, that brings up a question. Jesus, the disciples, Jesus wanted the disciples to be childlike. He wanted them to be childish, which is a lot of times what happened, but he wanted them to be childlike. And so we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to get into heaven, what does it mean to be childlike? I was thinking about that this week and just meditating on my own thing. Okay, God, what are the characteristics of a child that are admirable? And I started thinking about that. Children, in many ways, are humble. Everyone around them is bigger and taller and more knowledgeable. And so there's sort of an element of humility in a child when they see everybody else around them knows more, is experienced more, is bigger. The other thing about children is they have a simple faith in God. Unlike adults, have you ever noticed kids don't analyze everything? I've got an analytical mind, and so whenever I'm trying to test out for something, I start running an analysis on this. Okay, let's stop for this one. Okay, this could happen, and I start overanalyzing things, and that's not good. They are naturally trusting when it comes to God. Children also are dependent upon others. They know they can't do some things on their own, so what do? They ask you, can I have this, can I have that, can I have a nice one, can I have a drink of milk, can I have something, can I have whatever, they ask you for those things. And it's funny, in James, I find so many times that I'm convicted by the verse, James 4:2, where it says, you do not have because you do not ask. There are times when I see a need in my life, and I want to work out that need, I want to solve that need, I want to take care of that problem. And God says, no, you don't have because you do not. And it's that simple, just like a child. And then the other thing I love is children are honest. Have you ever noticed that children do not have filters? They will tell you exactly what they think. Wow, you have big stuff. Or you have big words. I was reading a couple prayers on children recently and all. And I just want to read a couple of these to you before we wrap up here. But dear God, I promise to never say those words again, at least until I get my next job. Dear God, I need you to make my mom not allergic to cats. I really want a cat, and I really don't want to have to ask my mom to do that. Dear God, did you really mean do unto others as they do unto you? Because if you did, I'm going to fix my brother. There's some honesty that kids have in their prayers and all this. This Pharisee, he went to the temple to pray that day, and he was so proud. He was trusting his own righteousness, and he looked at contempt of the tax collector and the others around him, because they didn't measure up their standard. The funny thing is, if he just come to Jesus like one of these little children, he would have gone home just fine. And I hope that that's a message for all of us today. There's an important life lesson in this parable for us. It would be easy to look at this parable and hold it to arm's length and go, oh, this is a parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector. This is about Pharisees. But I think there's just enough Pharisees in me and maybe all of us at times that we need to really hear this when Jesus says here. What about us? Are we trusting in our own good works to find favor with God? Maybe not even earning salvation, but maybe God's going to be happier with me when I have my great devotion come this morning than when I overslept and had to run out the door. Do we look down on others who don't measure up to the spiritual standard, false spiritual standard that we set ourselves? The Scripture commands us each to examine everything carefully, to hold fast that which is good. We're about to go to communion this good. We're about to wrap up our service by going to the Lord's table. And in Corinthians, Paul says that before we go to the communion table and take the bread and the cup, we are to examine ourselves. It also says that we celebrate communion because it says, remember to the Lord's death until he returns. And I was thinking about this week, and this is a reminder that it was his death that paid for our sins, not in good works. And so every time we come to this table, it's a reminder that we're not earning our way into heaven. We're not earning favor by God. Yeah, let me say this. That doesn't mean that we stop reading the Bible or stop praying or stop tithing or stop attending church. But we don't do those things to earn the favor of God. We do those things because we're already in the favor of God. And there's a gratitude in our heart because as we look at, just like Paul did, as we saw more and more of the poverty of who we were, we had a more and more grateful heart for the things God has done in this life. And that is the gratitude that we have, that as we see ourselves in the light of who Jesus Christ really is, it produces a greater gratitude in our lives for all that Jesus has done for us. So, Father God, we thank you for this morning. And Father, so often I can see my own self in that Pharisee, where I can hold others in disdain if they don't meet up to the standards that they don't want to meet. I believe to do that. Father, sometimes I'm so busy about my schedule that I forget about the people who you place my heart. So today, help us to be those who want this gospel of confidence. Humble himself and start out to mercy, recognizing the goodness of God that you answer prayer. And Father, as we take the cup today and we take the bread, we'll remind that the death of Jesus Christ until he returns, that we can do nothing but deny the finished work of Jesus Christ. And may we rest in your love. We ask in Jesus' name. Jesus gathered with the disciples for a Passover meal, and he gave new significance to that Passover meal. And I don't know how much they fully understood that night as he explained it to them, because I know that every time that they came in, I see nuances of truth in that celebration that they had received before. But Jesus, he told them to do that in remembrance of him. And so it was to be an ongoing reminder that one day he's going to happen. And as we take the bread, we think about the suffering that Jesus experienced in the body. And if we take the cup and think about the blood that was shed, the one thing that was very significant in the change between the Passover celebration and the Lord's Supper, between the experience today, was that the Passover was meant as a yearly celebration where the people came and covered their sin. When Jesus died on the cross and shed his blood, and really covered our sin, it removed our sin. And that's the beauty of it. It's not like we're sweeping our sin under the carpet just so other people couldn't see it. Jesus brought in the vacuum cleaner and sucked it all out. And you know, that is how we live in the grace of God. That's what calls us to do things we do. That's what calls us to be here on Sunday morning. That's what calls us to go into that place of prayer or to hunger after his word or to get to the things of God. It's not because we have to. It's not because we're trying to make him like us for it. It's because of what he's already done. And that's the joy of God. It's that he's already done it. So in that night, when he broke the bread, he said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And let's do that in the remembrance of God. The next time you cut yourself with a bleed, and it hurts, think about the fact that Jesus had his blood for us. Jesus took the cup and said, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood." Father, thank you for the gift that you've given us in Jesus Christ. Lord, we want to express that gratitude. We thank you for the mercy and the grace and the compassion you've given us through your Son, Jesus Christ.
Let's stand and sing together.